Hi again, Logan here from the DonorsChoose.org office to talk about screening class trip and class visitor projects, which we lovingly refer to as CTCVs. You already know how to screen the majority of these projects. Just like with special requests, the main difference here is in screening CTCV resources, which we'll be talking through today. You'll know that you're screening a class trip or a class visitor project because of the banner at the top of the screening page that says Class Trip Project or Class Visitor Project. As a reminder, if you ever need a refresher, you can click on the Show Tips button on the banner, check the guiding statements on the left side of the page, or you can access an overview in the Instructions tab at the top of the page for a more comprehensive refresher. Now, to begin, let's discuss what exactly a CTCV project is. Well, it's either a class trip or a class visitor. A class trip takes students on a trip outside the classroom, while a class visitor brings a special guest into the classroom or school. In this training, we'll discuss how to screen a CTCV project, we'll show some examples of acceptable payment documents for CTCVs, we'll explain how these differ from special requests, then we'll explore reasons as to why you might draft a CTCV project. When screening a CTCV project, we'll begin the same way as we would with a standard project. As you know by now, the first step is to scan the information at the top of the screen. After that, review the classroom photo, then move on to the project title and screen the resource summary to get an idea of what we're looking out for in the project. The resource summary for class trip and class visitor projects should be detailed enough so that people know what the trip is, but it also should not provide sensitive information like dates or costs. Let's look at an example. My students need $1,200 to go to the Dallas Zoo on March 13th to learn about biology. Now, as you can see, this mentions both the cost and the date of the trip, which is not acceptable for CTCV projects as it reveals sensitive student information. So with some quick and simple changes, we can make this into a much nicer and much more eligible. My students need to go to the Dallas Zoo to learn about biology. After you've checked out the resource summary, we'll begin screening the meat and potatoes of a CTCV project, the actual trip or visitor. There are two ways that teachers can upload payment information for CTCV projects. First, the teacher can submit an official payment document, such as an invoice for the experience, just like they would in a special request project. An example of this could be a class trip sponsored by an agency or an invoice from a bus company for transportation. The second type of acceptable payment information is a screenshot of pricing information. Now, this is where we start to differ from special requests just a little bit, because in CTCVs, we are able to accept screenshots as payment information. I'll dive more into that in just a bit, but first, let's talk about official payment documents. For projects that submit an official payment document, you'll look out for the same things that you would look out for in a special request project. As a reminder, here are the requirements for an official payment document. It's created by the vendor, which is usually the trip facilitator in the case of a class trip or class visitor project, but it is not created by the teacher. It contains company contact information, such as a phone number, an email address, or a mailing address. If it is addressed to someone, it's addressed to the teacher. And lastly, the vendor must be based in the United States. Additionally, when screening the payment document, you'll want to double check that the event or payment date on the document matches the event or payment date that the teacher submitted. If the payment document doesn't indicate the date of the event, we will trust that the teacher input the correct information. Here's an example of an acceptable payment document. Just like with special requests, notice how it has all the necessary information. You can see that it was created by the vendor. It's addressed to the teacher. You'll have to ignore the second misses on here, but I promise this one's correct. The visit date says October 22nd, 2018, which matches what the teacher submitted on the project. And we also have the number of students and the total cost right here. So we know that it's $800. Now let's move on to the second acceptable form of payment information, a screenshot of pricing information. Like I mentioned, for CTCVs, we can be a little more flexible than we are with special requests when it comes to payment information. So for CTCVs, we can accept information such as a screenshot of pricing information, a PDF of a vendor email, or even screenshots of food costs. An example of this could be a screenshot of the McDonald's menu, where the teacher would take a screenshot of the menu and just allocate a certain amount of cost per student. For these forms of payment information, the screenshot or document must show the cost per person. The teacher will provide the information on how many students and teachers will attend the trip, and you can confirm the total cost by adding up the price per student and then comparing it with the trip cost. Now, in some cases, the payment document might indicate a deposit. If the deposit is requested in the project, the teacher must input the first payment date that the deposit is due as the date of the actual project. If they do this, it's eligible. If the teacher has already paid the deposit and it is not included in the project cost, this is also okay, and they can put the date of the trip as their event date in the project. The scenario that we don't want, however, is a teacher that's already paid the deposit and is including it in the project cost. As of right now, we don't reimburse prepaid deposits. A couple of things to note. One difference between special requests and CTCVs is that in a CTCV, a teacher can request partial funding. For example, if the trip is $2,000, but they are only requesting $1,000, this is okay for us to approve. Another important note is that teachers cannot request airfare unless the price is locked in with a payment document by a trip provider. This is because the cost fluctuates a bit too much. After reviewing the payment document, we'll need to classify the payment by selecting whether it's an invoice or a reimbursement. If there are multiple requested resources, you will need to classify each resource individually as either an invoice, a reimbursement, or a W-9. A project may have a mix of both types of payment classifications. There are 3 options when classifying a payment. If we pay the company directly, it's an invoice. For reference, most projects will be classified as invoices. If the teacher pays the company, then it will be a reimbursement. There are 4 scenarios that will let you know if the teacher is paying and the project should be classified as a reimbursement. The first is if the teacher is requesting food costs, such as money to take students to a restaurant, that will always be a reimbursement. Second, if the teacher is requesting lodging costs to provide students with a hotel room or a place to sleep for the night, that will also be a reimbursement. Next, if the screenshot or the vendor email that the teacher submits mentions that the teacher must pay in person, that should be classified as a reimbursement. Finally, if the screenshot or vendor email states that they must have a card on file, that's another sign that you should classify the payment as a reimbursement, since that's not something we're able to do. Lastly, if the payment is to an individual instead of a company, we will select W-9. You should note that this will only appear for class visitor projects. Like I mentioned, it's possible that you could have a project with one resource that is classified as an invoice and one that's a reimbursement, or another mix of these 3. Now, let's talk through some of the most frequently used draft reasons. Flight rate not locked in. If the teacher is requesting a flight, they can only do so if it is locked in through a travel agency. Due to the fluctuation in flight costs, this must happen, otherwise you should use this draft reason. Deposit due for event date. If the teacher has listed the date of the event as the event date, but there is a deposit due before then, and the teacher is requesting that deposit, you should use this draft reply to let the teacher know that they need to change the date on their project so that we can make sure that payments are in on time. Date discrepancy. It's important that the trip date or the first payment date, whichever comes first, is within the next 2 to 8 months. If it's not, use this draft reply. Event prepaid. If the event has already been paid for by the teacher, use this draft reply since that is not allowed on our site. Salary request. Teachers, substitute teachers, and assistants cannot request salaries and fees on donorschoose.org. If you see a project where this is requested, use this draft reply. And finally, separate items. If the food, travel, and housing expenses are not itemized, as in they are not listed as separate resources on the project, we'll need to send the project back to the teacher using this draft reason. The exception to this is if they are requesting this as a bundle program where one company or agency agrees to provide all of these together. Sometimes you should flag a project for staff instead of sending it back to the teacher. Here are 2 scenarios where you should flag a project. Not a trip or visitor. If a project has been submitted as a class trip or class visitor, but there is no trip or visitor component, flag the project for staff. If you're having trouble viewing the payment document, flag the project for staff. We'll follow up with the teacher and make sure that it was submitted correctly. And that's how you screen a class trip, class visitor project. As always, if a project is particularly tricky or if things just don't feel right about the project, you should always feel empowered to flag the project for staff attention. Our team will take a look at the project and provide some extra follow-up for the teacher. Additionally, you have the option to skip the project. If you skip the project, I recommend that you take a look in the instructions tab before doing so to see if you can figure out what needs to be done with our resources. If you still don't know how to proceed, then you can skip the project and post in our Facebook group or email task@donorschoose, and we can help you figure out what the right move would have been. Now that we've learned how to screen CTCV projects, let's screen a couple together. So, the first thing we do is just scan the information at the top, so it looks like we're working with a high school teacher in Indiana. So we look at the project title, Bringing Germany to Rural Indiana. Looks great to me. The resource summary says, my students need funding to support a cultural learning and experience in Germany. This trip through ACES, American Council for International Studies, is all inclusive. Airfare, meals, lodging, and actives are all included in one price. Other than actives, this looks pretty good to me. I'm thinking that she meant to say activities, so I'll just go ahead and do that right there. Activities, there we go. And click looks good. Now let's move down to the trip details. So here, the teacher has provided a brief description, which is just for us to see. So this tells you the dates of the trip and what they're doing. In some cases, this will reveal important information, and sometimes it's just nice to know. So here we see the company, the total cost, and we'll scroll down and look at the payment document. So first things first, the event date needs to match March 1st, or at least be after that. So the event date here says March 16th through 24th, so that looks good right away. So the next thing that we're going to want to look for is to verify the cost. So here we see that it's $3,447. So let's look and see if anywhere on this payment document we can see a cost. So this is showing the itinerary, might be fun to look at, but it's actually not necessary. Oh, and here we go. The tour cost and participant fees. So as you can see, the total cost is $3,447, which is what the teacher is requesting. As you can see, there are some additional fees as applicable. One, we can guess that these aren't applicable just because it's not necessary, but even if they are, that's okay because in CTCVs, teachers can request partial payments. So this looks legit, it has the things that we want to see, so we're good to go with the resource. So now we'll need to classify the payment. So this is something that our team can pay for. We will work directly with the vendor, so the teacher is not going to be reimbursed. We'll click invoice right there. Undefined students and undefined adults. So this is usually where the teacher would say the number of students. In some cases, this is important if you need to calculate the cost per student, but since this is a bundled program, it's okay in this case. So we can just say, looks good. And in this case, we don't need this because the resources aren't being shipped anywhere. But in the event that it were, this is what we would use as the teacher's school address. And like usual, I've screened these essays ahead of time. They're actually very well written. So we're going to click looks good for both of them. And this is a really cool project. A group of rural Indiana high school students are going to get to go to Germany and Bavaria and other places for a little over a week. So I'm going to give this an A+ and approve the project. Here's another project. So as we can see, it's another class trip. Let's get to screening it. So the classroom photo, let's cover the green oval around everyone's faces, and it looks like none of them are too big, so that looks good to me. The project title says, Help Us Learn Through Play, City Museum, St. Louis, Missouri. The title looks fine to me. There's no grammatical errors or anything, so I'll click looks good. The resource summary says my students need a field trip to the City Museum in St. Louis, Missouri. Great, we know exactly what to look out for. So we look at the trip details. We should be looking for a total of $560 for a trip to the St. Louis City Museum. So it looks like the teacher has submitted a picture, but nothing's popping up. So let's click into it to see where it takes us. So it looks like we're not able to view the price quote. So this is an instance where we should flag the project for staff, and we can just click can't view price quote and flag it, and we're good to go. So let's take a look at this project together. So at the beginning, we know we're looking at a 3rd through 5th grade project in Alabama, in elementary school. It's another class trip, and as we can see, it was previously drafted for price quote requests, so that might be something we need to look out for. So here's an example of a title that we'll need to correct. It looks, as you can see, it's in all caps, and that's not something that we want to look for. So I'll go ahead and change that to we want to learn about cultural diversity. If you'll bear with me here while I type. Diversity, great. Now that's capitalized like a book title, and we can click looks good. So the next is the resource summary. It says my students need financial assistance so they can attend the Mobile International Food Festival so they can be exposed to cultural diversity. Great, that looks good to me. So now let's look at the actual price quote. So we know that we're looking for the International Food Festival, and it should be a total of $620. It says financial support is needed to cover the cost for a field trip. This is a 1-day trip in November, so that falls within our 2 to 8 month window, which sounds great. And it looks like it's a showcase of different cultures and their foods, which sounds good to me. Love me some food. So let's look at the price quote. So the first flag that I see here is that this is just a Word document, and there's no indication that this is created by a vendor. This looks like something that the teacher actually might have just typed up. And so that's something that we'll definitely want to draft. So when we go through this, we'll click Needs Teacher Edits and Price Quote price quote request, which will let them know that we need an actual price quote that is vendor generated, as you can see. So when we're doing this, make sure you fill in the brackets so that it says for the total cost of the International Food Festival. And then if it was a real one, we would select invoice. And let's scroll down and view the rest of the project. Again, for the sake of this, there's no mistakes here that are red flags. So we'll click looks good on both of these and send the project back to the teacher. And that is how you screen class trip, class visitor projects. Thanks for hanging around with us while we talk through all of these.